Hello and welcome back everyone. Let's check out what we did in the last video. Let's pull up Visual Studio Code. In the last video, we did a get request, two get requests, a post request, a put request, and a delete request in the index.ts file. But we cannot code everything in a single file. Since we will be dealing with multiple entities in the database, we need to have separation of concern in our code base. We will follow the MVC, or Model View Controller design pattern of structuring our code base. And so we will take this all off, all these requests, and we will begin building our code using the MVC design pattern. But before we do that, let's look at how MVC works. Let's pull up a diagram. In this diagram, we look at how the model view controller works. So this is our database over here. Inside our API code, which we are doing at the moment, we will have models. These models are basically representation of the tables in our database. This model also allows us to access the database, and it converts MySQL code, which we'll be using, into JavaScript code, which we can use to interact with the database. And this component here is called the controller. In an MVC app, the controller is where the magic happens. All the logic, all the manipulation of data, and all the business rules, all the processing of requests, and the pushing out of responses. That's what the controller does. And so once it's processed in here, the major processing is done in the controller. It pushes it out to the view. The view is what the user interacts with, and in this example, the user may be using Chrome or a mobile app or whatever other device they use to interact with whatever's coming out of these API. And the API might return HTML pages or simply just API endpoints, URLs, which the user can plug into, and they may make requests, and the request goes into the controller, and the controller uses that request to access the models and retrieve data and return it to the controller, which then pushes it out into the view, which the user can interact with. So in our Books API app, in our code base, which we will be building, this server right here, we will be using a more detailed way of using MVC, and I'll show you in a moment. This is our design for our API. So when a user makes a request, take for example from a browser or whatever front end application we developed, Express uses Express and HTTP. It uses a routing system. A routing system basically takes in the URL endpoints and exposes it to the user, who can then access these routes. These routes are basically routes into different controllers of every entity that exists within your database. For example, in our database, we will have information about books, and information about authors, and information about readers. So all these entities, books, readers, and authors, they will each have a model, and they will each have a controller, and each controller will have different routes. For example, there will be a different route for a GET request for books. There'll be a different route for a POST request for books, different routes for delete, and different routes for updating information on the database. And so Express uses Express routing, which will then I'll talk about middleware in a second, and the routes goes into the sends the requests into the controllers, and the controllers sends the requests right into the model. These two additional components, they simply separate your code further, to separate your code further into more decoupled components, which makes it easier for us to manage and maintain our code. So this is how the app will work. Inside the when the user makes a request, it hits the router, and the router sends it to the middleware. This middleware right here, they what they do, this is what pre-processing is done in this middleware before it is sent into the main controller. For example, you can put authentication and authorization here in the middleware. If a user is hitting a route and they are not authorized by the application to use this service, the middleware will return a response that rejects their request right over here. And so that's what an example of what middleware does. And you can do so many things inside the middleware before the requests goes into the controller. For example, passing of data, validation of data, authorization, and authentication. So when the request hits the controllers, the controllers then divides all these operations into their respective services. For example, the books controllers will be connected to the book service. The authors controllers will be connected to the author services, and the readers controllers will be connected to the readers services. And so each model, for example, reader and books and authors, they're just basically representing all the tables and entities that we have stored in our database. And so that's basically how our project will be structured. Routes, middlewares, controllers, services, models, and our DB and our database at the back. And so when a user makes a request, it runs through all these. These are basically just components of codes that are separated and decoupled so that we can easily maintain and test them. And when the request has been processed and the data is retrieved, it returns it back to this pathway right back to the user. So without further ado, let's take off this diagram and look into our code base and just look at a few examples of structuring our code in an MVC pattern. Okay, so in our code, let's create different folders for each of our different components. We will create a controller. Let's name it controllers. A controllers folder. A routes folder. A services folder. And a models folder. All right. First of all, let's start with our controller. So if I Control Z this one, we'll see the structure of server requests. This is a GET request, a POST request, and a PUT request, and a DELETE request. The common components of all these requests is there is a route and there is a callback function. And basically, this is a route and this is a controller. And so we can separate these two sets of code into their respective folders. Let me zoom that out. We can separate these into their separate folders. To make a GET request controller, we will create a books controller.ts file. And let's just export a function over here, an async function. Async function, and let's see, get all books. And the format of this controller is we will have a request interface and a express response interface. So let's put it over here, request from express, and a response of type response from express. Let's just send res.send. Let's just send back a message saying getting all book list. Sending back a list of books. The list of books. All right. So I am exporting this function, and I will export it to a books router. Let's say books router.ts, and to create a route, we will import curly braces from express. We will import the router interface from express, and we will create a router over here. We'll create a books router. Books router is equal to router, and books router, we will create a get request. Books router dot get. Let's just put all get all books, for example, and we will import this controller over here, get all books. And to do that, we'll just simply import get all books. There it is. And then we will export this books router, export default books router. That's how you separate. I have separated this route and this controller into their respective folders for the books. And so to expose that to the front end, we will let me just take off all this code. We'll create a use route over here, server dot use and I want to import the books router into my index.ts file. So I'll name this route books, and I will import the books router inside over here. And that's basically it. I have created a books router, and I've imported that router for our entry point to use. And let me just put a slash, wrap this off. So let's test it out and see if it works. Let's use Thunder Client. And test out. Let's run our server, npm run dev. Our server is running on port 8012, and we will put a slash over here, books, and let's create a get request. And it did exactly as we coded. In our books controller, we are sending back a message, sending back the list of books. And when we make our get request, we get the response 200 okay, and we see this message displayed when we hit our API endpoint. In the later videos, we will be using this controller solely for the processing of requests and express responses. And we will be using this services folder for the processing of all the requests that we will be making to our database. We are using the Prisma library to access our database with MySQL, and we will be making all those processing of accessing our database in our services folder. So I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.